Let me introduce the session chair, Professor Sri Kumar. Professor Sri Kumar is a senior faculty member teaching communication design at the IDC School of Design at IIT Bombay. His expertise is in the area of typography, type, calligraphy, publication design, information graphics, and anatomy and life drawing. Prior to IIT Bombay, he has professional experience at Jasubai Digital Media, Intelligent Investor, the Indian Express, the Independent, and the Metropolis, Bombay Times, Doordarshan, Trivandrum. Over to you, sir.
Namaste, a warm welcome to all of you. It is a pleasure and honor to be a part of this wonderful event, and I'm very happy to chair this session. And I would like to thank Dr. Rathna for accepting our invitation and agreeing to give our keynote address. This keynote address is in memory of our mentor, Professor R.K. Joshi, and it is titled Professor R.K. Joshi Memorial Lecture. Let me introduce our keynote speaker. Professor Dr. Rathna Ramanathan is the head of Central St. Martin's and Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of the Arts. Previously, she was Dean of Academic Strategy at Central St. Martin's, and before that, Dean of School of Communication at the Royal College of Art. Originally from Chennai, India, she works in communication design, particularly within a South Asian context. Her practice is fueled by a love for and lifelong interest in typography and languages, and a belief that communication is a fundamental human right. As a graphic designer and typographer, she is best known for her work with Tara Books. She has co-authored and published multiple books, many of which have won international design awards. Her key research areas are intercultural graphic communication and alternative publishing practices in the Global South. She was actively involved in our Typography Day conferences in the past, and I offer a warm welcome to Dr. Rathna. Vanakkam and Swagatham. Namaskaram.
Vanakkam, namaskaram. Hello, everybody. What a lovely welcome, and so nice to see old friends. I think we're all a little bit more gray than the last time we met in person, but still, nevertheless, nice to be here. Professor Joshi, Professor Puvaya, Professor Sri Kumar. Maybe it's best I could just start sharing my screen and see if everybody could see it. You could focus very much on the screen rather than on me. And I'm really going to talk about, I think it's a great privilege that this is an R.K. Joshi memorial talk. And I think there's so much about his practice and the way that he set up typography and practice in India in particular. So I'd like to talk about an Indian approach and what that means in terms of typographic practice. We don't normally get asked to talk about these things, a different way of doing things or expanding our way of thinking and making. So my focus today is about typography for and with children in the medium of the book. And this will be based on my work with Tara Books, which was an independent feminist publisher that's based in Chennai. Now, as a typographer and a graphic designer, I work primarily with text. And when I say typography, I really am talking about design for reading. And I think this is really important to clarify, because sometimes we talk about written text and the importance of writing. But as someone who works with typography, my primary concern is always about the reading of text, often in multiple languages, often for different kinds of readers, whether that's children or adults. So people who have different capabilities and fluencies. The other important part of my approach to typography that I think is important to say here is I'm very interested in how typography can be a fundamental way to understand and engage with the world in experimental ways, but also in mainstream ways. So typography is a craft, but by using typography, we can help people understand and engage with the world differently. Now, we've spoken a little bit about Tara Books, and I've worked with them for a long time. And their approach to typography has helped me sort of build this thing about typography for children. They started in 1994, and they were a group of writers and designers. And from the beginning, they were interested in changing the perspective of books and the way that stories were told, particularly for children. And the Tara approach made me really curious about how people use alternative modes of publishing or independent modes of publishing. And this became the focus of my PhD at the University of Reading. Now, I learned through Tara that making and designing and producing is based on community. So publishing is largely a collaborative work where the success cannot be attributed to one individual, and therefore it's always slightly odd to consider sole achievement in design process or publishing process, because by nature it is about dialogue and collective, and it depends on the works of the others in the team. Now, Tara saw India's rich and very popular vernacular art traditions, and they felt that this was missing from books in that time in 1990. So their mission was really to bring life to children's books, because otherwise children's books were quite dull as a norm. Now, this is a picture of Tara in their space, and this includes not just writers and designers and publishers, but everyone who has a role in making the book successful. That's also because there are, marketing people, there are publishing people, the production people, the booksellers, the binders. So everybody has an equal role in making the book successful. And I think this is really important because we often focus on the author. But here, when you treat everybody as equal, the designer also then has a bigger say. Now, this way of working is reflected in their space. And as a very small company, they couldn't afford space very much. So they worked in different rented spaces till they could finally decide how they wanted to create a space that was based on how they work. And this is called the Book Building, and it's in Kuppam Beach in Chennai. And it's the headquarters of Tara Books since 2012. So the building works with free-flowing spaces where creative people can meet and gather and collaborate. You can exhibit work, you can make books together. And this is the kind of their practice. It reflects their approach to publishing practice. When you walk through the building, you're reminded of Tara's work on the pillars and in the courtyards. There's spaces to do different kinds of work, speak with each other, work with children, buy books, have talks, but also have discussions about the way that it works. So there's both the private and the public, just like in a book, we're privately reading, but it's a public activity that kind of links in with how the building is organized. Now, when I asked the publisher Geeta Wolf what she sees publishing as, she said it was a conversation. And for me, this was very interesting as someone designing the book, because the conversation becomes between the book and the reader, and then typography becomes the thing that facilitates that conversation. So Geeta said, at Tara Books, we think of the book as a moment in time. It's a picture of a much longer process. There's first the story of how the book was made, then you have the book itself, and then once the book is published, you have the story of how it is read, and then what happens because of that reading. And when we're designing books for children and we're thinking about typography for children, it's important to think of all of these different stages. Now, in the case of I See a Promised Land, typography became a conversation between cultures, and it was a collaboration between two people from very different walks of life. This is the story of Martin Luther King Jr. through the patwa art of the artist Manoj Chitrakar. And the words are from the writer and American storyteller Arthur Flowers. And what this does is it takes a graphic novel means, that's American, let's say, and links it to the Bengali scroll art tradition with contemporary texts. Now, Martin Luther King dedicated most of his life to the thinking that all people should be equal. And it's interesting that this book brings together a patwa artist and a very well-known American storyteller and equates them. Now, the London Jungle Book, some of you may be familiar with. It's by the Gond artist Baju Sham. And this is really interesting because the Jungle Book was about someone from England coming to India. And this is sort of a decolonial statement about Baju actually going to London as well. So typography can also be a conversation across cultures. And sometimes the book, and therefore the typography that's prompted by the context of the book, gives voice to nature and to animals. Now, Tara aims to reverse the anthropological gaze through its engagement with folk and tribal art in its visual and handmade books. So it tells stories of how all of us inhabit the world, not just human beings. And this is a very important value to translate to children, that it's not just humans who inhabit the planet, but that we share the planet with animals, birds, and other creatures. Now, typography for me is also about expanding ways of reading. And I think when we are in a design culture that's often got a Western canon, we need to pay attention to how people read differently based on different cultures. So, for example, in India, you'll see that people read publicly. You read newspapers aloud, you read as a community, we read and we discuss things together. But in the West, reading is a very private activity. So if reading for us is a social and public activity, then the typography needs to also respond to the difference in the context of that reading. And one example is that we very rarely distinguish between children and adults in our stories, Mahabharata, Amachitrakatha. So quite complex stories in India are told to children as well. So Tara decided to start ignoring this barrier between adults and children and opening up the books and the typography and allowing children and adults to interpret that themselves. Sometimes it's very difficult stories like this one, which is about the war in Sri Lanka from the eyes of a young boy. And this is for slightly about 10-year-old children and above. And typography plays an important part in how this boy sees the world, because he sees numbers and words quite differently. The other way of expanding reading is explored through typographic play. So whilst we acknowledge typography as a craft, as I said, we could use it to understand the world. So when a child is reading this and the type is moving, the way that they read it aloud, their voice changes because the shape of the words and the action in the words encourages them to use that in their voice. And Tara's approach to picture books in the very beginning challenged the conventional separation of this is where the image should be and this is where the text should be. So typography became a place to race across a page and to build a story. And we explored voice, we explored accent, we explored tone and context. And each bit of the typography was designed to reflect the world around the book rather than just the text. So it played an equal voice to the author, to the illustrator, and then the designer. All three were equally important. Now, typography is also politics. Publishers like Tara Books sometimes challenge the process by asking the designer to have a voice as an author. And they were among the first in India to acknowledge that design is a very, very important part in the publishing process. And that book design can be very strict when it needs to be, like in an information book or a dictionary. It has to be quite strict and conventional because we're going to those books for information. But in books like this, it can be warm, it could be intuitive, it could be humorous, it could be quite rich and varied. And typography then responds to the context of the book and to the intended audience. So the book and typography can also become like a research space where we use typography and language and aesthetics to kind of convey quite difficult topics. So sometimes it's not just about making things look nicer, but how we can show meaning in different ways. So here there are no images in the book. There's only Futura that's used throughout the book, and Futura is used in a very kind of limited palette to create typographic pictures that tell the story about war within the book. Now, sometimes typography can also be a platform for those who don't have a voice, because a book can also be a very elite space. Who gets published, who doesn't get published, who becomes an author, who doesn't become an author. When I spoke to Geeta about this, she said that language is not just the sense of words, but also language can be very visual, and we're a very visual culture in India. So Tara works with people who may not be textually literate, but incredibly visually sophisticated and visually literate. And this allows voices to get heard in a book alongside language and typography. This is one example of how very simple typography can help challenge gender, caste, and class. This is the case of Sangeeta Jogi and her recent book, The Woman I Could Be. She lives with her extended marital family, as well as it's a joint family system. Sangeeta comes from a community of farm laborers, and her life is very much based in a rural community with very limited means. And they're based in Rajasthan, and they're known for a very strict patriarchy. So women are expected to be veiled. They're not seen to be active in public life. And this was a real challenge for Sangeeta, who had a really extraordinary creative outlet for herself, and started to think about what it would mean to be a modern woman. How would it be if she could set an example for women? So here, image and type became a way of giving Sangeeta, who is a woman from rural Rajasthan, a voice within a book in a modern book design. And that's quite an empowering thing, not just for us in terms of the stories that get told, the voices that get heard, but for Sangeeta and her community as well. So book is also about challenging convention, and with typography, we can challenge convention. We've already spoken about who is an author, who gets to be in a book, whose story gets told, but also who gets to read the book. And sometimes this challenge is about the language that the book is in. For Baju, he wrote the book in Hindi, and he wrote the book so that many people in his community could read and access it, which they couldn't in English. So one of the ways of providing access through typography is to ensure that the stories return to the languages and to the original linguistic context. But typography is also needs to pay attention to how books are made. So when I first came to Tara, they were thinking of starting a silk screen unit to produce their books. Now, in a Western context, this is quite crazy. It's like, oh my God, that's be so expensive. And how would we do it? You could only do offset books. But in an Indian context where there's craft and labor, this makes perfect sense and it's very economical. Importantly, this whole operation provides a livelihood for people who are producing the book, who you can see here, and the materials become organic and sustainable themselves. So they add, through the process, they add to the notion of the book. And so come from constraints about what we can and we can't afford. You get creative thinking and innovation, which is an important design lesson for us. Sometimes typography is questioning the Western canon and the roots of that canon and really asking ourselves, what is typography? What does it mean for us in this context as readers in India and people who want Indian stories to be heard across the world? Now, in the Indian context, with palm leaf manuscripts, the codex is a colonial intervention. So we should also be thinking about typography in its many forms and many book forms. So here on the left, you see the Tsunami by Patwa artists. We see the Scroll as a graphic novel. So books have a different rhythm, and we rarely explore this rhythm because we're stuck to the Western canon. But if we open up this idea of typography and the book as an object, that leads us into different interpretations of what reading can be. So coming back to expanding practice, I'd say that my journey with Tara has caused me to question and challenge my own assumptions about design, typography, and publishing, which I learned primarily from a Western context. So I'd like to wrap a little bit by starting to talk to you about some of the learnings that I've had. As many of us in this audience have the privilege of knowing and experiencing, making typography for me is a collaborative conversation. It's not an individual conversation, but it's a place where we as typographers can bring diverse voices together, whether that's of the child and the parent reading things together, whether that's bringing together the author and the illustrator on the page, whether that's bringing together the printer and the publisher in thinking about how the book should be and how the book is designed. And a good book is one where you can't tell who has done what, but you simply enjoy the book and its reading, and all of the makers sort of disappear because they are in the book object that's with you. The second thing is not to stereotype and make presumptions about how people read. children read very, very differently from adults because children have not, particularly children who are very early learners, see images and text and are much, much more open to typography and reading than we are conventionally as adults, because our reading has been shaped. So working with children, a lot of the books that I've shown as examples today were tested with children, checking with children whether they understood them, and then working with them as co-designers. And that has been the most exciting part of this journey, is that typography, to serve these diverse readers, you work with the readers in the design. Finally, typography is authorship. And I know that we're speaking to a group of designers, but I think this is my real understanding. And it was a real privilege to work with a publisher who saw design as such an important voice, as really integral to the making of meaning. So then design is not just direct decoration, but making of meaning and giving the whole thing a shape as a process, not to just come at the end to finish it, but to be a part of it throughout. This is a really important aspect, especially in a digital age, is for us to understand production values and what happens. So in my early days at Tara, I had to realize that, for example, if we're printing on handmade paper, the typography can't be very thin because the bulk of the paper spreads the type. So I see typography as a material. And this is equally important as content in how typography is shaped. So understanding material, understanding paper, understanding the context of screen, and understanding where people are going to read this is also equally important in how we shape typography, particularly for children. So for example, with children, we can't have the books be too big because they will be bigger than their bodies. So then how do we kind of size that down in a way that they can hold and that would be actually relative to them? So hence my point about typography is a material. We've spoken about this, and this is typography is expanding readership. That when we work with children, we need to have a child's mind and open our minds to the way children see the world, not just adults see the world. And sometimes it surprises us that they see it very, very unconsciously, imaginatively, and innovatively. And it's a nice way of us actually responding and having that dialogue with them within the book. Typography is essentially for me about how we see the world. It's a place of change. And I think when we live in a difficult world and we're bringing up children in a difficult world that's complicated, typography can help us exhibit the right values, the way we want to approach the world with kindness in relation to other human beings, in relation to nature. And finally, for me, it should be more than just about the people in the room. I think that exactly things like this Typography Day, it's about bringing more people into this conversation. It's about really a method by which you can have a conversation with multiple readers around the world, whether they're children or whether they're adults, and getting them to understand that a book can be a place of learning. It can be a place of conversation. It can be a place where we reflect our own selves in the world and we learn about ourselves through books and typography. I think that gives us to about the amount of time. So I'm going to stop sharing and say thank you to everybody who's given me a chance to speak today at this really exciting conference that's dedicated to a really important topic and one close to my heart, which is typography for children. And that's also for us as adults who are still children inside. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rathna, for your wonderful lecture today and for starting off the proceedings. It was very informative and it was a wonderful experience listening to you. I will open the floor for question and answer session now. I request all the participants, please feel free to ask your questions.
Shri, I have a question for Rathna.
Sure, please carry on.
Rathna, a wonderful talk, very nice to hear you. So I have this, dilemma that, we are moving into this new media, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the world of tangible books, which is so very important for children, gets missing when you go into the new technology modes. Okay, what is your take on this? No, I'm saying that the students are more keen on doing something for that media rather than the books, which they see it as a traditional old media, it's the same thing. When we used to write letters, it used to be so nice to receive a letter which is handwritten, right? And
Yeah.
that whole media itself has disappeared.
I think that there's a lot of research that's been done, like in the University of Reading, about reading and typography. And I think that we read in different contexts and we read for different contexts. I think that we could read for pleasure, we could read for study, we could read for information. And I think that's getting very mixed up with social media, with phones being our primary device. And there is a lot of research about how reading on screen affects our ability to read, that our span of attention is changing and we're less able to pick up complex bits of information because we're used to very bite-sized information. So where I come from, I feel like, yes, we do need things that are designed on screen because that's the world we live in, but it should be contextual. So I think that, I don't know about how many people actually read, like if you're reading an article for research, you're often printing it out to understand it, to footnote it, to kind of engage with it in research. So I get worried, in your point, about skills that we will lose generationally if we don't keep to the book as a space, because there's something about the object and that. And it's not just reading, it's writing. You spoke about writing letters. When we write on tablets, and they're trying to get that to be as close to paper as possible, but technology, nothing still beats the pen on paper. Whether that's a remarkable pad, whether it's a Kindle that you're reading, they're all trying to get as close to the book. Because when you read with paper and with ink, there's something about how our brain perceives those things. And you could argue and say, well, Rathna, that's a generation. You've grown up with, we've grown up with books as in schools. But I think there's a lot of research, like I said, about attention span and reading and attention within the book as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
So I have a question for Dr. Rathna.
Yeah.
So how do you find this concept of multilingual typography in children's books?
I'm quite excited by that, actually. And I think that because this was about typography for children, I didn't talk about the work that I do with the Murthy Classical Library. Shri, we've talked about it before, which I think is a really important, venture. That's a charitable venture to bring our texts back before we forget about them and we forget how to read those languages. So I think that when you go anywhere in India, you see that any sign, and often designed by people in this room, is multilingual. And it's not just two languages, it's not bilingual, it's trilingual and it's quadrilingual sort of. And we're used to seeing that context around us in the world. So it feels quite strange that you might have a book that's only in one language. So I think that there is starting to be explorations for children in two languages, because I think of language ability with them. But I'm quite excited about exploring that, not just for adults, but for children as well. And I think India is very well placed to do it because we are quite fluent speakers. All of us are at least speak two languages, and that doesn't include English. Despite separate from English, we at least speak, mother tongues and language. So I think it's the right context for us to make a contribution to multilingual typography.
Thank you. I'm just reading out some questions from the participants.
Shikumar, can I ask a question, please?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Hi, this is Ajanta Sen. Rathna, I really like the fluency with which you've presented very complex constructs, that too in a narrative, which is actually a metaphor for how children learn best. And so you've moved from community to collaboration, to conversation, to cultures. to context, and then from there to the agency of the voice versus the print, and within the print, just the text and the illiterate, and therefore bringing in a multiplicity of readers, and within that, of course, the very important context of the vernacular and languages which we have ignored for so long, and also bringing in the codex of the colonial, because English became right. I mean, English just sort of subsumed everything, every text and English, and we forgot that we are a culture where we are social and collaborative, and we read out loud, and we are a loud culture. And so what?
Absolutely.
And it reflects it is not about writing, which is, and we discussed this in our last typography day, where this fantastic scholar from an Orient scholar, Professor Mohanty, who said, do you wonder why the word is more powerful than script? Because script is just 5,000 years old. Word is 100,000, like at least 18,000 years old, right?
Yeah.
And to ignore that. So I really like the way you, not only that you've brought in these, but you went step by step. And within that, you were able to bring in the agency of the child versus the adult. And from my own experience in recent times, where there's this concrete example of design thinking and innovation being formally introduced into a schooling system led by Professor Puvaya. And I was very much, I'm fortunate to be part of the design thinking, workshop with adult, principals of schools. It was amazing when I actually spoke in the language of children for them to understand how design thinking, the process should be. And I use Tara books, the book by Badsham on water.
Yeah.
All of these books that you mentioned, I have managed to buy most of it. And when you talk about the tangible, Tara Books has these, has this numbering at the back of the book, which says, because it's limited edition, it's like a piece of art, the 50th of 3,000 book, 856 of 3,000 book. And today for me, those books are like, it's like having a piece of jewelry, literally. And I took them to show it to students at IDC, and it brought out the childlike quality of the students. They were like sitting around and handling the book and buzzing. And these are people who do nothing but use the computer all day long. And suddenly they were like,
very interesting.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing in these qualities in such a nice way, such a remarkable way, and not making it so cognitive. You managed to keep it tangible, visual, audio, all of the sensories. And I don't know how to thank you. So it's more
thank you so much.
But,
I love what you said about we're a loud culture. We're an oral culture. We spoke our texts before we read our texts. And I think that's really, really important. How do we bring that orality back into this? It's absolutely amazing. And what you're saying about the agency of the child and the adult is absolutely right. I think Professor Arjun Appadurai talks about research not as an elite activity, but as basic curiosity. And I think that's, for me, really, really exciting in the way that we think about our profession. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rathna. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Rathna, I am just reading out some of the questions which came in the chat box. So one important question which came is from Pujana Prasanna. Hi Rathna, thank you for the illuminating presentation. I had a question about reading disabilities. As the world moves towards an inclusive space, how do we factor in reading disabilities and other things that we generally don't factor in as much? Especially when we talk about typography for children, braille also comes to my mind.
That's a great question. I think that our first step in that is reframing that as different reading abilities. Because I think that then changes how we approach it. Because with different reading abilities, our focus and how we read characters and words and shapes, or with the word that you're saying, with tactile, sensory ways in which we can read, becomes then important. So I think it's really about how can we give, so I would say that we haven't explored enough the idea of typography as a voice or as a material. And I think these things can help us think about that. I think that at the same time, we shouldn't forget the bit about typography is for reading. So there is a purpose for that, for who it's for, that audience, I think, Pujna. And then the second one is that typography is a craft. There's technicality to it. I read something in a particular way. I can't read something in a particular way if I'm dyslexic, or I'm dyspraxic, or I have ADHD, for example, and my attention span is such. These are all design problems that we then can create design solutions around and design around. But I don't think we have equated those neurodiverse ways of looking at text as much as there is a certain hierarchy, isn't it? And it is a colonial hierarchy about text in itself. But before printing came to India, we were an entirely visual culture. We printed with lithography. We didn't print with letterpress. So this idea of text does come from letterpress heavily as a medium. So I think going back to Ravi's question earlier, I feel like the medium of screen, the page, and how we actually create the page. I remember when some of the software programs came in the 90s, it suddenly allowed you to move around the page in a way. PageMaker, for example, Quark, allowed us to free up the page in a way that we hadn't been able to do so. So I hope that answers your question a little bit, but I think I would say there's a science to it, there's a design to it, but there's also a social context to it. And bringing these three triangles together then gives us a sort of framework by which we could design.
Thank you, Dr. Rathna. Thank you, Pujana, for this wonderful question, because it is very important to all designers and typographers to think in these lines. I'm just reading out another one from Nitin Daga. Ma'am, how do printing people and craftsmen add in the making process? What does a designer take from them in the making?
That's a really excellent question. Thank you for asking that, Nitin. I think that with a very, very big publisher, mainstream publisher, often the industrial process of printing and design gets disrupted because we design something. You might, a book of fiction, you may not design it. You might just design one page, and then the typesetter takes it over and actually designs it. So I think with an independent publisher, there's a real privilege and a pleasure that you can work as a team that's working on something, and you can have that dialogue with each other. So in that, it's the best of the design process. You could test things. You can speak with different expertise. So you can ask the printer, is this going to work? You could think about where you place typography on a page. Is that going to get scrunched up in the binding? How do I actually work the page in a way that it has rhythm and it has that fluency? So I think, what do they add in the making process? Their own expertise. And you learn from them on a really regular basis about typographic materiality, about what would look good on a certain paper might look completely horrible on another paper. So it becomes a craft in itself that's not just on screen, that's contained on screen in a very kind of clean way. But the moment you take it out into the real world and you're starting to produce it, you realize actually all of the things that you thought in your head may not quite be right. So really engaging with printing, production people, crafts people right from the beginning, in the beginning of the design process, before we start designing the typography or the book, is really, really essential. And keeping that as an iterative part of the conversation, always going back and forth and testing things is a really important aspect of the design process when you're working with others.
Thank you, Dr. Rathna. I'll just read out the next one from Sudhirtha De. For reading print media is important. How important is it for children to write in vernacular and Western languages?
I think I mentioned this slightly separately, but I'd say that the reason that the Murthy Classical Library came into being was because of Rowan Murthy went to Harvard University to study. And he realized that actually that they were studying Indian texts that we were not able to study in school. And I think this is a really important part of Indian education that I hope will change in time, is that we don't have access to our own knowledge, our own texts, and our own stories in our own languages. And it's really, really integral that we do that at different levels in education. So I think to your question, how important is it for children to write in vernacular and Western languages? I think that being vernacular and bilingual culture, it's really important that we start to bring that reading in both, and that we don't forget. Because the worry about the multi-classical library and the reason it came about being, there was a professor called Sheldon Pollock, and he said, there are 3,000 years of Indian knowledge that could get lost if we lose the ability to read and write in our own languages, because this knowledge is contained in Indian languages and not in Western languages. So it is a really big moment that's not just about that child, but having generations of readers who are fluent in vernacular languages. But also, with India being so rich in a language tradition, that we're able to read each other's stories. So I don't read Marathi, for example, I read Hindi. But the fact that if Marathi was placed next to English, I would be able to access Marathi stories as well. Now, the dream, of course, would be to have texts that were translated in multiple languages. But I think that is the hope of the library. And I think we need digitization and excellent translation to come to that. So I think it's really important that we keep the oral nature of language equally important as reading and writing.
Thank you. I'll read the next one. It's an interesting question from Avani Kale. Do you think having knowledge and experience of working with multilingual and multi-script typography helps in any way while working or studying in the West, in countries where only one language or script is commonly used? Or is this somewhat irrelevant to the work that is done there?
I think it's a really thoughtful question, and I'll lean a little bit on the work. So my research is in intercultural communication. It's basically between different cultural contexts. I think that knowledge and experience of working with multilingual, multi-script typography helps you place knowledge, and you have to be really sensitive to different voices when you're designing on a page. Who do you give preference to? Do you equate the two of them? When the writing systems are really quite different, so let's take, for example, let's take Hindi and English. How do you put them on a page for different kinds of readers and equate them together? How do you give a Hindi speaker equal prominence, for example, as an English speaker? So for me, the sensibility of thinking of different languages and cultures helps us be really sensitive, even in a country where there is only one language or script. So I'm based in London, I work in London, but I'd say that there are different cultures within London, different kind of, so you have different cultural communities, immigrant communities that come to London. Having a sensibility of their languages and those contexts is really important, because you have subcultures. Even if you don't have different language cultures, you have subcultures within languages. You see it in India, for example, in terms of our dialects. We have hundreds of dialects, but not so many in terms of languages. So I'd say it's a real tool. It's a lens to how you see the world. And it gives you a certain sensitivity in terms of how you balance different ways. If I was going a bit further, I would say it's a decolonial approach, because it equates other knowledges and other languages rather than giving prominence to one. And I think that's a really, really important design sensitivity that we need more of in the world. I hope I've answered your question, Avni, with that.
Thank you. Next question is from our friend Ishan Khosla. He says, good to see you again in another forum. How do the children of the folk and tribal artists respond to the work of artists from there, or even by other communities? If you have any insights on this, I'd love to hear.
Okay, it's a great question. I think, Ishan, maybe I'll say two things. When the books were being created at Tara, these were by people who are family people. And to come and work at Tara, or for us to kind of go and work with them, was working with families and seeing children being present while we're working with parents on something. I think in some ways it was quite bemusing, puzzling, that actually, like, my mom's working on a book. That's kind of, that's not kind of normal work in that sense. And I think that it starts to put a little spark in there about the possibilities of change. And I know that's something you're interested in it as well. How do we raise the profile? How do we get the world to see the work of our folk and tribal artists and how absolutely sensational and visually sophisticated that is? So I'd say that's one way. The other way is when the work is published and it goes back into the community, less so when it stays only in English, much more prominent when it actually comes back into the community in the vernacular language. And that sometimes takes investments because a publisher wants to ensure that there is a market for the language readers in that sense. The final thing I'd say is, in language or not language, there is something amazing about the power of the book object. To see one's name as an author, to see one's, is an immense thing that goes against our caste and class, in the sense of you only think about, very learned people being authors of books. Often we don't see ourselves as being able to author books. And I think that topples that hierarchy for both the adults as well as for the families in a really interesting way. But there's a lot of work. I think we're your question is scratching at the surface of the work that we need to do. I think that work is just beginning. I think that, you're bringing a really important aspect of how do children then perceive it, and how are we sort of, changing a generation there about the potential of what they can do and how they can contribute to the world. And I think that's a whole other question that I know that you're also involved in with your own work.
There is another one from Arnav Kumar.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, ma'am. Indic scripts have some unique characters like Yuktakshar, which sometimes become very difficult for children to understand and write or pronounce. Do you think there can be an early level typography curriculum introduced for children, initially learning about letter forms to enhance their letter comprehension?
I think, Nanav, you've sort of answered the question yourself. But I think that's absolute. I think that in the time maybe that I've known Typography Day, the scholarship in this area has been sensational, has increased so much. And I know little faces popping around, and I've seen faces. There's so much of postgraduate research and PhDs that have come out of IDC and come out of India that pay attention to even the language or the terms that we use to describe our scripts, which are very different from, let's say, ascenders and descenders. So I think that the first step is for us to have a real kind of Indian typographic education for us, because I think that type design has absolutely transformed in the past couple of decades. But perhaps where there is work for us to do is typographers, is the use of those beautiful, incredible typefaces and the people working on those typefaces, and us getting to kind of understand them and how we use them. So I think what you're basically saying is exciting all of us in the start of that kind of typographic learning, not at university level, but at a very early, early school level, primary school level. So I think that, I think that's worth getting in touch with the publisher about. You're absolutely right.
Okay, Dr. Rathna, we have come to the conclusion of the session today. Thank you very much for answering all the questions, and thank you very much for the wonderful talk. Over to Radhika and
Yes, sir. Thank you, Professor Rathna, for the talk. And thank you, Professor Srikumar, for chairing this session.